What's up, fellow cartographers? It's Josh with Map Effects, and today I want to walk you through how to draw cliffs on your fantasy maps. It's pretty straightforward to draw, but it adds a lot of depth and character to your map, and it almost looks like it's just popping right off the page, so I think you're going to have fun with this one. The first thing I like to do is actually sketch out the top of the cliff, so we can just do that by doing kind of just a sweeping line like this. And we can just play around with it to make it a little bit more interesting. So let's kind of carve into it here. Can erase this away. And we'll have this kind of taper down on the edges. So that's kind of our basic top of the cliff. Let's zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. And then just to get an idea for it, we can do these sloping lines as if we're drawing down the face of the cliff. And with this one, it's going to actually be hidden by the edge that's here. So we're just going to draw right down to there. Something like that. And let's come over here and just kind of tease this out a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of your basic idea. And one thing you can actually do if you're working in Procreate or Photoshop is you can use the liquify tool. And the fun thing about this is it allows you to just kind of push things a little bit further, and just tweak them a little bit. This is a really good idea to do this right now while you're still sketching. So you don't have to worry about kind of messing up the sharpness of your line art. This gives you the opportunity to just kind of play with the edges a little bit more, possibly exaggerate things a little bit more, and just kind of come up with something that works for your map. Okay, now that we have that done, let's come back up here and we're going to create a new layer above our sketch. And I'm going to switch the color more to like a deep brown color. And let's switch to a liner brush. These are all the brushes that are included in my Cartographer's Liner Brush Field Kit. And I think I'm going to go with this cliffhanger brush right here. So let's see. Let's scale this down a little bit. And all we're going to do is kind of just follow these guides that we laid down when we put down our sketch. And you kind of want to make this line a little jagged. This is rock after all, so we don't have to worry too much about making our lines too perfect or too smooth. Honestly, that's one of the issues I tend to see with people that are starting to draw cliffs. And actually, I don't like how straight that line looks. You can see I'm just kind of using some dots and dashes right at the end to just kind of taper it down. All right, so that's kind of just the top of the cliff. So now let's come back and we're going to kind of be looking for these points. And this is where we're going to start drawing our cliff faces down, just like we did in our sketch. But this time, instead of having such a smooth line, we're going to make it a little bit jagged. We want it to look rocky. And it's all right to kind of slope it in like this. And then this one is going to come more this way. And I need to come over here and do this one. And let's have it kind of jut out a little bit. And then once again, this one is kind of obscured by the edge of that cliff right there. And let's come in and just do a couple more of these. Okay, just something like that. And actually, you know, as I look at this, I don't really like how long of a span this is without being able to see the cliff face. So I'm going to come back in here and just kind of erase away a little bit of this. And we're going to kind of cut it in just right there. And that just gives us the opportunity to add one more little edge in here. And actually, let's have this jut out this way. Oop. A little bit more. Something like that. Okay, so let's come back into our layers panel and let's take our sketch and just remove that so it's not distracting us anymore. And we can now start looking at these cliff faces, and let's come through and add some sedimentary layers. So it looks like there's just layers of rock built on top of each other. So we can kind of look at one of these like points and just start using some broken lines to just follow the cliff face. Okay, and it's all right to break your lines up a little bit. We'll just add a couple of them in here, a couple there. And let's undo that. Let's try that again. Should be coming out more this way. Okay, and we can come back and do another layer. If we want to, we can make this one just a little bit more subtle, so it's just hinting at some layers rather than being so stark. Okay. And now let's start looking at the top edge of this cliff. And everywhere that it kind of comes to an inner point here or here, we're going to draw a line and use kind of a dotted broken line to draw up the cliff. And this blends the very top of the cliff in with the rest of the terrain a little bit more seamlessly. Okay, like I said, you can tell that I'm kind of just doing little dots and dashes here and looking for these inner points of where the rock would be overlapping. You can also come to these edges and do some little lines to just give it a little texture. You're really just adding in a lot of little pieces of texture, which will just help the cliff look a little bit more organic and natural. And then we can come in and start adding a little bit of texture on the cliff faces right here. And we can do some more vertical lines, we can do more horizontal lines. And honestly, just kind of work loose. It's real easy to get a little too stiff when you're doing this. And you'd be surprised what these little scribbles actually end up adding. It just is texture that you're drawing in, so don't be too precise with it, don't be too perfect with it. Just have fun. Says the person that tends to be a little bit too perfectionist, so I totally get it. So that's kind of the basic look, and if we wanted to, we can come into this terrain and just keep adding some of these dots and dashes. Just kind of tease it out a little bit more. Okay, just something like that. And now if we wanted to come in and add some color, the way that I like to do it is I'll create a new layer below my line art, and we'll just set the blend mode to multiply or linear burn. You can play around with it and see which one works better for you. I tend to do multiply though, it's not as saturated. And then I'm going to switch to this kind of darker shade of beige that is kind of based on this background color. And since it's a multiply layer, it's going to darken it quite a bit more. And then I'm going to switch to this heavy marker brush that I have here that is a liner brush, but I actually really like to use it for most of the shading that I do. You can see as I lay down color now that it has a little bit of opacity to it. You can build up the color as you do more layers of it, and it has a little bit of kind of paper texture baked into it. So let's make this a little bit smaller, and let's imagine that the light is kind of coming from this direction. So we're just going to start blocking in just some really basic shading on these cliff faces, just like this. Actually, I'm going to make this brush a little bit bigger so it goes a little faster. Okay, and don't worry about making the bottom edge of this as it blends into the landscape too pretty or too perfect. It's all right for it to be a little rough looking at this point. In the next step, I'm going to blend that out a little bit with the smudge tool. That's how I like to do it. Okay. Something like that. Oops. Put down 2 layers accidentally. And I'm going to make this brush a little bit smaller, and I'm going to come back through and just block in a little bit of shading on following some of these overlaps and edges that we created earlier. Just deepen this up a little bit. Just like that. And at this point, in a lot of ways, you're kind of using your line art as a guide that is informing where you're laying down shadows. So when in doubt, usually you can throw down some shadow next to the line that you drew in the previous step. And we can also just throw in some texture shadow out here. All right, and so that's kind of our basic look. I'm now going to switch to the smudge tool, and you can see this is actually a smudge tool that I have in my freebie kit that I like to use. It has a really nice rough edge to it. And the reason I like this one is you can really achieve a painterly texture with this. So I'm just going to come through and just blend out this edge of where I laid down that first layer of color. And you can kind of blend it up into the cliff. You can blend it more down depending where the light is. I know the light would technically be hitting here a little bit more than it would be over here. So I'm going to kind of blend this up a little bit to lessen the shading. And this doesn't have to be too perfect. When you're doing shading, it's really a good idea to start with more broad shadows, the bigger shadows, and worry about that first before you really start coming in and worrying about these details. If you do that too soon, you tend to get a little bit of tunnel vision and lose sight of the bigger picture. And if you make a mistake, it's much harder and more time consuming to fix it later on. So better to work from big to small. Okay, so then we have that. I'm actually gonna, sometimes I create a new layer to do this, sometimes I don't. For this example, I'm going to create a new layer, set it to multiply, and I'm going to darken this color just a little bit, and I'm going to desaturate it just slightly. And we're going to come back to my heavy marker brush. And now I'm going to follow, let's make this a little bigger. Now I'm looking at this edge here of this cliff. This, right below this cliff edge, would be where the shadows are darkest. I'm going to now come through and lay in a little bit more color, particularly along this edge. This is when the cliff really starts to pop, and you start to get a little bit more depth, and it really starts to stand out off the page. Okay, and now let's come to these sediment layers, and this is kind of like another edge. So let's follow that, and we'll add another layer of color just below this sediment layer that we added in the previous step when we were working on the line art. And I'm going to add a little bit of shadow here where this cliff is overlapping the other cliffs. Just kind of gives it a little bit more separation. Do that here. Whoop. All right, it's looking pretty good. And if you want to, you can come back to your smudge tool. Let's make this a little bit smaller because I don't want to lose all of these edges. The real danger with the smudge tool in general is you can end up making all of your shadows too smooth. It's kind of the reason I like so much texture in this smudge tool, because it kind of stops me from it looking too overblended. But even then, you don't want to make this too smooth or else it'll look really digital and fake. So you can just kind of come in here and just kind of, you might end up with some accidental texture that looks kind of cool. So I feel like that's looking pretty good. I'm actually going to come back through and create another multiply layer. Make this brush fairly big, and sometimes you'll realize that there's areas that just should be darker in general. So you can kind of come back through and work broadly again after you've already gone through and done some of this. Switch to the smudge tool and just blend this out a little bit. There. Now I feel like we're getting a little bit more contrast. And now, since this is all on its own layer, you can come back up here and you can play with the opacity a little bit so that you can see exactly how much shadow you want to add in. So I think just kind of visually looking at it, I'm going to stop somewhere around there at 70%. And I'm pretty happy with that. So you can see just kind of coming through, just deepening that shadow a little bit actually made quite a big difference. All right, so last we need to come through and add some highlights. So let's add one more layer. I'm going to switch it to add. You can also use screen. And I'm just going to pull from this lighter color here. I'm going to use my heavy marker brush again. And we're going to, here, let's do this. Let's tone down the add layer. It tends to brighten it up quite a bit depending on what color you use. Now I'm just coming through and just kind of brightening up this very edge here, just like that. We can make this brush a little bit smaller. I'm going to lower the opacity quite a bit on this brush. And I'm just going to hit a little bit of light onto these areas here on the cliff face. You don't want to go too crazy with it because this is supposed to be in shadow, but it helps add a little bit of contrast if you can brighten some of that up. Then you can also come through on the rocks that are below the cliff, add a bit of texture into here. Also add some up here. You could have also added some more shading and such up here too. I just forgot to. Hopefully this is giving you an idea of kind of how I like to think about it. All right, so let's zoom in so we can see a little bit better. I've got our smudge tool again. I'm just gonna blend this out. You can kind of tell with the way that I work that I'm almost doing this instead of erasing. It helps me to kind of move the paint on the canvas around a little bit more, and I kind of move pigment back and forth. I add it back in, I kind of blend it back out until I get something that I'm happy with. Okay, and I can come back in here, kind of adjust this opacity again. I think I'm going to kick it down to somewhere in the 50s. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You can see that it kind of really looks now like this is actually dug into the page, and you can come back through and add some mountains and all kinds of other features and such. But I hope you found that helpful, and I look forward to seeing your map.